If she translates, I'll give her my job. Millionaire laughed. Till black girl spoke Chinese language. The Harrington estate stood like a monument to old money and untouchable privilege. An expanse of glass, marble, and history perched on the outskirts of New York City. Its conference wing overlooked acres of manicured gardens, a place where billion-dollar deals were made over vintage wine and carefully rehearsed charm. Every morning, the staff moved silently through its halls, polishing the reflections of a world they would never belong to. Among them was Maria Alvarez, a woman who had spent 20 years in quiet service to other people's comfort. She came from Queens, where the mornings began with bus rides and grocery lines, not chauffeurs and crystal decanters. Her hands were calloused from years of scrubbing floors and serving tea, but her eyes carried a grace the mansion could never buy. Everyone saw the uniform, few ever saw the woman inside it. Her daughter, Elena Alvarez, was the piece of Maria's life that didn't fit into anyone's assumptions. At 23, she was a graduate student at Columbia University, studying international relations. Her professors admired her discipline, but few knew what truly fueled it: the memory of growing up watching her mother be invisible. Every thank you spoken through clenched smiles, every condescending glance from executives who didn't know her name, had left quiet imprints in Elena's heart. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. From a young age, she had promised herself something simple yet fierce. She would make sure her mother's worth would never again be measured by her apron. That promise shaped everything. The late-night study sessions, the side jobs tutoring Mandarin beginners, and the silent hours she spent mastering tones, grammar, and cultural nuance. For 3 years, she studied Mandarin, not for credits or grades, but as a private rebellion against the arrogance she had witnessed all her life. Maria, on the other hand, never asked for more than respect. She found dignity in doing her work well, in being on time, in anticipating her employer's needs before they were spoken. Charles Harrington, the real estate tycoon who owned the mansion and the company that bore his name, had always treated her with distant politeness. He was not cruel, but he lived in a world where kindness and hierarchy could comfortably coexist, as long as the latter was never challenged. Then there was Ethan Cole, the company's vice president, young, confident, and loud in the way men become when they've never been told no. He liked to fill the silence with jokes, often at others' expense. His arrogance wasn't new to Maria. It was simply another tone in the long song of her working life. What she didn't know was that one offhand remark of his would soon become the turning point of both her life and her daughter's. On that particular morning, the estate was alive with anticipation. A delegation from China was arriving to discuss a $70 million international property deal, the kind of partnership that could double the company's global influence. Every detail had been rehearsed: the presentation slides, the catering, the interpreter's arrival time. But fate has a way of unraveling even the most polished scripts. The interpreter called moments before the meeting. An emergency, she said, and she couldn't make it. Charles Harrington, pressed for time and patience, decided they would improvise. "We'll manage," he said, unaware that those words would soon echo with irony. By noon, the conference room gleamed under the weight of expectation. Mr. Li Wan, the visiting Chinese entrepreneur, arrived precisely on schedule. His demeanor was calm, disciplined, the kind of composure that comes from being both feared and respected in equal measure. He spoke only Mandarin during business, a rule that his team followed strictly. Ethan didn't mind. In his mind, language barriers were nothing but a game of charades, something he could laugh through. Maria entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea and snacks, jasmine, green, and oolong, prepared exactly as Mr. Li's assistant had requested. She placed them on the table without a word, her presence blending into the background as it always did. But in that silence, tension started to brew. Mr. Li spoke in long, fluid sentences in Mandarin that no one understood. Charles offered an awkward smile. Ethan leaned back, smirking. Without the interpreter, the entire meeting stood on the edge of collapse. What was meant to be a smooth negotiation was now a storm of confusion. Charles whispered for someone to take notes, just in case. Ethan, ever the entertainer, decided to lighten the mood. He turned toward Maria, the woman who had just poured his tea, and said with a grin that carried decades of inherited entitlement, "If you can translate what he said, I'll give you my job." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through her silence. Maria froze for a moment, unsure whether to smile, to leave, or to simply disappear. She chose the third. With her eyes lowered, she retreated toward the corner, her dignity shrinking with every chuckle that echoed through the room. What Ethan didn't notice was the sound of footsteps outside the door. Steady, composed, and dangerously calm. Elena had come to drop off her mother's lunch, something she did now and then when classes ended early. But that day, she arrived just in time to hear Ethan's words and the laughter that followed. She stood still for a long moment, her pulse steadying as her mind processed what she had just heard. Rage wasn't her first reaction, it was clarity. Years of watching people like Ethan laugh at people like her mother had prepared her for this. She knew exactly what to do, but not yet. Timing, like translation, was an art. Inside the conference room, the air thickened with discomfort. Mr. Lee didn't understand the joke, but he understood tone, and tone, across any culture, speaks louder than words. His expression shifted, his patience thinning. He straightened his posture, his silence more dangerous than any outburst. And just like that, the stage was set. A room full of men about to learn that humility doesn't come from wealth, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room speaks the loudest language of all. The meeting that began as a negotiation was quickly unraveling into a slow-motion disaster. Every passing second deepened the silence, the kind that hums just before a storm. Mr. Lee spoke again, precise, deliberate, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable chill. The executives exchanged anxious glances, trying to decode his tone, his gestures, anything that could hint at his meaning. But no one understood a word. Charles Harrington's smile tightened. Ethan, growing restless, leaned back in his chair, spinning a pen between his fingers like a man who thought the world was a stage made for his jokes. The only person who seemed unfazed was Maria, still standing by the door, eyes downcast, her presence dismissed like background noise. Yet, behind that quiet posture was a mix of hurt and humiliation that she tried to bury under years of practiced composure. Outside, Elena stood frozen in the hallway. Through the frosted glass, she could see the shapes of the men seated around the table, her mother's faint reflection, and the slight tremor in Maria's hands as she clutched the edge of her tray. Every laugh, every condescending word replayed in Elena's mind like a drumbeat. The promise she made to herself as a child, to protect her mother from people who confused humility with weakness, came rushing back with burning clarity. Inside, tension escalated. Mr. Lee's assistant whispered something in his ear, her expression serious. Mr. Lee nodded, then spoke again, this time in a longer, more pointed monologue. His voice rose slightly, cutting through the air with quiet authority. No one could translate, but everyone felt the shift. This wasn't a polite business discussion anymore. His tone carried disappointment, displeasure, a hint of warning. Ethan, still ignorant of what was being said, gave a dismissive chuckle. "I think he's complimenting the tea," he said lightly, drawing a forced laugh from one of the junior associates. But the humor died instantly when Mr. Lee's eyes met his cold, sharp, assessing. Then came the moment that would change everything. Mr. Lee folded his hands and said something clearly, decisively, his voice calm but final. His assistant, in broken English, translated just one line. "If no one here can show respect or integrity within 5 minutes, Mr. Lee will leave." The color drained from Charles's face. Leave, he muttered, eyes darting toward Ethan. The vice president, for the first time, looked unsure of himself. Millions of dollars and years of partnership were slipping through their fingers because of arrogance disguised as humor. That's when the door opened. Slowly, quietly, Elena stepped in. She wasn't wearing a power suit or carrying a portfolio. Just a simple blouse, dark jeans, and a calm, unwavering expression. Her mother's eyes widened in confusion and fear. "Elena, no," she whispered under her breath. But it was too late. Elena had already crossed the threshold. The room turned toward her, half in shock, half in annoyance. Ethan spoke first, his voice dripping with disbelief. "And who are you supposed to be? Another maid?" No one moved. Charles rubbed his temples, the situation spiraling beyond his control. Maria stood frozen, torn between pride and panic. Elena didn't flinch. She took a measured breath, her tone calm, steady, and sharp as glass. "No," she said quietly. "I'm here to make sure your company doesn't collapse before lunch." She turned toward Mr. Li and, with perfect tonal precision, greeted him in fluent Mandarin. The sound of the language, smooth, respectful, and confident, sliced through the room's tension like lightning through fog. Every head snapped toward her. Mr. Li's eyes widened, his expression transforming from irritation to surprise, then to something resembling admiration. For a moment, even time seemed to pause. He responded in Mandarin, testing her fluency. She answered effortlessly. The conversation flowed, natural, seamless, and fluent. The executives stared as though watching an impossible trick unfold before their eyes. Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. "She's Maria's daughter," he said aloud, as if the fact alone should disqualify her. But Elena only smiled faintly and replied, in English this time, "Yes, and that's exactly why I'm here. To remind you that intelligence isn't inherited through wealth." Charles said nothing. He didn't need to. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. Elena turned back to Mr. Li, translating his earlier speech with precision. Every word, every phrase, rendered with the tone of respect it deserved. The executives listened, stunned, as she revealed what he had actually said. That he came expecting professionalism but found arrogance instead. Mr. Li nodded after every sentence, confirming her translation. Then, with quiet confidence, Elena took out her phone and pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the room, his mocking words, his challenge. "If she can translate what he said, I'll give her my job." Silence. Cold, suffocating silence. Ethan's face flushed red. "That's out of context," he stammered. But the damage was done. Mr. Li looked directly at him, unimpressed. Elena continued, now explaining the details of the deal in Mandarin. She caught a discrepancy in the numbers, a $1.2 million error in the yuan-dollar conversion rate. Mr. Li leaned forward, intrigued. He confirmed her correction, impressed by her sharpness. When he asked how she knew so much, Elena explained, still in Mandarin, about her graduate research, a cross-cultural AI translation program she'd been building called LinguaBridge. One that didn't just translate words but context, tone, and cultural meaning. The executives listened, dumbfounded, as Mr. Li's stern face softened into a smile. He was no longer looking at her as an employee's daughter. He was looking at a potential partner. But before anything could be finalized, he made one condition clear. He would only continue negotiations if she handled the translation and protocol. Not the vice president. Not the team. Her. Ethan's jaw clenched. Charles, desperate not to lose the deal, nodded immediately. Ethan tried to object, but Mr. Li raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Maria stood motionless, her emotions caught between disbelief and pride. Her daughter, the same girl she used to walk to school with lunch wrapped in paper, was now commanding a room of millionaires with nothing but composure, intelligence, and grace. But the moment wasn't over yet, because what none of them knew, not even Elena, was that this victory was just the beginning. The true reckoning for arrogance and disrespect was still to come. And as the meeting moved toward its climax, one thing was certain. In that glass room where power once felt untouchable, justice had finally found a voice fluent enough to be heard. The air in the Harrington conference room had shifted from tension to awe. The polished glass walls that once reflected arrogance now mirrored something new: respect, fear, and disbelief. Elena sat across from Mr. Lee, translating each segment of the negotiation with calm precision. Her tone carried confidence, her words flowed effortlessly, and every sentence deepened the silence of the executives around her. Ethan Cole, the man who once laughed loudest, now sat pale and trembling. His arrogance had curdled into panic. He could feel his position slipping, yet he still didn't fully grasp that his downfall was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. As Elena finished another translation, Mr. Lee turned to her with quiet admiration. "You have the discipline of a diplomat," he said in Mandarin. Then, facing Charles Harrington, he added, "This young woman, she's the reason I'm still at this table." The statement landed like a verdict. Charles forced a nod, his pride swallowing the taste of humiliation. He knew what it meant. His $70 million deal now depended on a young woman he'd never met, the daughter of a woman whose name he'd likely never remembered. Ethan leaned forward, desperate to reclaim control. "Mr. Harrington," he began, voice tight. "We can't let—" Mr. Lee cut him off with a single gesture. "In my culture," he said, his English slow but deliberate, "words have weight. When a man mocks a woman's dignity, he loses the right to lead." The sentence hit the room like thunder. Charles turned toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. But Elena wasn't finished. She gently placed her notebook on the table and looked at Mr. Lee. "Before we proceed," she said, switching back to Mandarin, "I want to address something you deserve to know." She played another recording, this time a voice note of herself translating his earlier speech about professionalism and respect. Her translation was flawless, but what stunned everyone was the tone. Calm, poised, full of empathy. When the recording ended, she said softly, "This was what you said, sir, and this was what they laughed at." Mr. Lee's face hardened. His assistant exchanged a glance with him, whispering something under her breath. Then he turned to Charles, his voice heavy with disappointment. "If this is your leadership," he said, "then perhaps I've come to the wrong company." Charles froze. Ethan tried to interject again, but Charles raised his hand sharply. "Enough!" For the first time that day, Maria Alvarez lifted her head. She had been silent through it all, afraid her presence might make things worse. But now, as she saw her daughter standing tall, defending not only her but the very concept of respect, her fear melted away. Ethan's composure was completely shattered. He stood abruptly, slamming his palm against the table. "This is ridiculous. She's not even an employee here. She's just—" He didn't finish, because Mr. Lee rose to his feet, his chair sliding back with a sharp scrape. "She is more professional than anyone in this room," he said firmly. "If she is not part of your company, then your company does not deserve this deal." The words silenced everything. The air, the whispers, even the hum of the building's ventilation. Elena glanced toward her mother, whose trembling hands clutched the edge of her tray. In that single look, everything they had endured, every insult, every dismissal, every whispered "help" and "clean up," collapsed into a single victorious heartbeat. Then Mr. Lee did something no one expected. He turned to Elena and asked, "Who owns this translation technology you mentioned?" "I do," she replied, voice steady. "Would you consider a partnership?" Elena hesitated only long enough to remember who was watching. She knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for every version of herself that had once doubted she belonged in rooms like this. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Yes, but not just as a translator. I want cultural protocol management rights and consultancy inclusion." Mr. Lee smiled faintly, clearly impressed. "Then we'll negotiate directly." Charles blinked, struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Directly?" he echoed. Mr. Lee nodded. "With her." Then he looked at Charles and said in a tone that left no room for argument, "The deal continues only if she becomes your company's international relations director." It was the corporate equivalent of a lightning strike. Ethan's jaw fell open. "What? You can't be serious." But Mr. Lee was dead serious. "This company needs people who understand respect, not just profit." Charles, his fortune teetering on the edge of ruin, had no choice. His voice cracked slightly as he turned to Ethan. "You're done here." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan's face flushed red, then drained to white. He tried to protest, to argue, to twist the truth, but every pair of eyes in the room had already seen what he truly was. The laughter that once filled the room had turned to judgment. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors like a retreating ghost. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, whispering, "Elena, what have you done?" Her daughter turned to her and smiled softly. "Something we should have done a long time ago." Mr. Lee extended his hand across the table. "Congratulations," he said. "You've earned not just a deal, but my respect." And just like that, the power in the room shifted forever. The maid's daughter had rewritten the hierarchy that had ruled that mansion for decades. Yet as Elena shook Mr. Lee's hand, she felt the weight of what came next. This wasn't just a victory, it was a responsibility. The eyes of every person who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or ignored were now watching through her. The deal would go through. The company would change. But the moment of silence that followed wasn't about money. It was about dignity reclaimed. As Maria wiped a tear from her cheek, her reflection shimmered in the glass wall behind her. For the first time in her life, she didn't look like someone waiting for instructions. She looked like a woman finally being seen. And yet, outside that shimmering glass, the world was still watching. Because even though justice had arrived in one room, Elena knew there were countless others still waiting for someone to walk in and speak their truth. She looked out toward the skyline of New York and thought quietly, "This is only the beginning." The days following the confrontation in the Harrington boardroom rippled far beyond the glass walls of that room. Word spread quickly, first through hushed conversations among employees, then through industry whispers, and finally across the city's business networks. The story of the janitor's daughter who changed the deal became a quiet legend, one that people retold not for its drama, but for its undeniable truth. Elena Alvarez's life transformed almost overnight. Within a week, she was officially appointed as Director of International Relations, a position that came not from favoritism or pity, but from undeniable merit. She didn't ask for headlines, and she didn't give interviews. Instead, she showed up early every morning, just as her mother once had, and built something that would last longer than gossip, trust. Her mother, Maria, still cleaned the hallways of Harrington and Cole for a few days after the incident. She said she wanted to leave properly, with grace, but the atmosphere was different now. Those who used to walk past her without a glance now greeted her by name. Some avoided her out of shame, others out of fear, but for the first time she didn't feel invisible. One afternoon, Charles Harrington approached her quietly in the lobby. He didn't wear his usual arrogance, only humility. "You raised an exceptional daughter," he said softly, "and I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." Maria looked at him for a long moment before replying. "You didn't see her," she said. "She made you look." That night, as she walked home, she passed the same spot where, years earlier, she used to rest her aching feet and wonder if her sacrifices meant anything. Now she smiled. Her daughter had turned those sacrifices into something powerful, proof that dignity doesn't come from the title you hold, but the strength you carry. Inside the company, the shift was undeniable. New diversity and ethics programs were launched. Anonymous complaints were taken seriously for the first time. Policies weren't just written, they were enforced. And while not every racist whisper disappeared overnight, the walls of silence that once protected them began to crack. Ethan Cole's name quietly vanished from the company's roster. No press release, no farewell email, just gone. Those who once laughed at his jokes now pretended not to remember them. As for Mr. Lee, he honored his promise. He and Elena co-founded an initiative focused on cross-cultural business ethics and equitable partnerships. The first seminar they hosted was titled "Respect is a Universal Language." Dozens of executives attended, not because they had to, but because they knew they needed to. And through it all, Elena remained grounded. She often returned to the janitor's wing, the place where her mother had once cleaned in silence. She would stand there, looking at the rows of mops and cleaning supplies, remembering every insult she had overheard, every door that had been closed. Then she would smile quietly and whisper, "We opened it." But her story wasn't just about one boardroom victory. It was about something far larger, the truth that racism doesn't always roar in your face. Sometimes, it whispers in polite tones, dressed in suits and subtle smirks. It hides behind policies, behind words like fit, culture, or professionalism. And the only way to expose it is through courage that refuses to be quiet. Elena's story reminded people that racism isn't just about hate. It's about hierarchy, about who gets to speak and who gets interrupted, about whose mistakes get forgiven and whose potential gets ignored. She hadn't set out to fight a system. She'd simply refused to let that system define her worth. Months later, when she was invited to give a talk at a leadership conference, Elena stood on stage and said, "Every company claims to value diversity, but diversity without respect is decoration. You can hire people who look different, but if you don't listen to them, you've changed nothing." The crowd rose to their feet, not because she said something revolutionary, but because she said something everyone knew and had been too afraid to admit. Her mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. The applause was thunderous, but for Maria, the real sound of victory was quieter. The soft, steady heartbeat of knowing her daughter had become what she always dreamed of, free. And yet, for every Elena, there are still thousands of stories unheard. Millions of people still waiting for someone to listen. For every boardroom that learns, others still turn away. But stories like this, stories of courage, of truth, of people who dare to speak, remind us that change doesn't begin in policies or protests. It begins in moments, in choices, in standing up when it would be easier to stay silent. Because racism doesn't end when one person wins, it ends when enough people refuse to lose quietly. So the question now is, what will you do when you see it? When you hear it? When does silence feel safer than speaking? Will you turn away? Or will you, like Elena, choose to make them look? If the story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. Because silence protects injustice, but voices like yours can break it. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone like Elena walks into a room, they won't have to fight to be seen. They'll already belong. What did you feel when Elena finally stood up and proved them wrong? Did her story remind you of someone who faced the same silence, the same judgment, yet still rose above it? Stories like hers deserve to be heard, because they remind us that strength, courage, and dignity can come from anywhere. If the story inspired you or made you think differently, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, let's keep these powerful voices alive.